on Washington to demand that you be punished for crimes that others committed. It's called the March for Our Lives, and it's designed to lobby for new gun control legislation across the country. The event is backed by wealthy and powerful people, billionaire Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, many others. Some of what they're calling for is unconstitutional and irrational. It cannot work, it won't work, and that's why it's not already the law. It's not just NRA lobbying, it's common sense. But the organizers would rather not get into all those details, and they certainly don't want to have all those debates, and that's why they're hiding behind the victims of the latest horrific school shooting. The kids are front and center by design. A handful of teens from Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida. Now, they have a right to their views, obviously. That is a given. This is one of the rare shows that supports the rights of people we disagree with to talk. But the rest of us also have rights, including the right to assess what they're saying and decide whether it ought to become law to which we are subject. These are not religious figures. We're not the faithful. We're all citizens here. So let's take a look at what they're saying and decide if it's a good idea or not. For example, here's David Hogg. He's a Stoneman Douglas student. You may have seen him on television. He's dutifully trotted out by the media as a gun expert. Here's part of his take.
The way Rick Scott has been talking about it is like, when the shooter arrives, we need a metal detector and a guard.
Point, with Rick Scott, it's like, when I get elected to Senate, we're not going to let that happen. What sick are out there that want to continue to sell more guns, murder more children, and honestly just get reelected? What type of person are you when you want to see more money than children's lives? What type of person does that?
We have to use our white privilege now to make sure that all of the voices that have, all of the people that have died as a result of this and haven't been covered the same can now be heard.
Sell more guns, murder more children, and get reelected. That is David Hogg's view of the other side of the debate. Emma Gonzalez, meanwhile, another celebrated survivor of the shooting, basically agrees with that. She recently said in a speech, quote, "I don't really care what people who defend the Second Amendment have to say." Let's take this seriously. We should take it seriously because it's serious. If you honestly don't care what the people who disagree with you think, if you believe they want to, quote, murder more children, then who are you? Well, you're angry. You're definitely not fit to be making policy for the rest of us. You are, by definition, an extremist. You should not have power if you really believe anyone who disagrees with you is evil and wants to kill the innocent. Maybe a journalist could point that out, but no. Journalists agree with Emma Gonzalez and David Hogg, so they've slapped them on the cover of Time magazine and declared that they're heroes, and you're not allowed to disagree with them. Here's more David Hogg from earlier today, by the way, explaining that the Bill of Rights matters when it applies to what he can wear to school. Watch.
After we come back from spring break, they're requiring all of us to have clear backpacks. It's unnecessary, it's embarrassing for a lot of the students, and it makes them feel isolated and separated from the rest of American school culture, where they're having essentially their First Amendment rights infringed upon because they can't freely wear whatever backpack they want.
So controlling your backpack abridges your First Amendment rights because the First Amendment applies to backpacks, but the Second Amendment does not apply to firearms. How does that work exactly? Wait, you say, why are you picking on David Hogg? He's only a kid. He shouldn't be held to adult standards of reasoning or be expected to think critically about the consequences of what he espouses. Well, yeah, exactly. He's a kid. He's just been through unspeakable tragedy. And that's why adults shouldn't be using him or his friends to push their agendas on the rest of us. Mark Glaze is co-founder of Guns Down, a gun control group, and he joins us now. So this is the problem that I have, is that if you sincerely believe that people who disagree with you want to kill children, then you shouldn't be involved in making policy, because that's exactly what we don't need more of, it seems to me. Why is he being pushed to the front of this movement?
Well, look, I think you ought to cut this kid a little bit of slack. You know, he was at school and 17 of his friends were killed the other day. Not everything he says should be taken as, you know, gospel from the gun violence prevention community about what we ought to be doing about guns.
Well, I just conceded that in my script because I agree with that this is a kid who just saw unspeakable tragedy. He saw his classmates killed, and that's exactly why he shouldn't be involved in formulating a response to it.
Yeah, but
because he's a kid. So you can't simultaneously argue that you need to shut up and listen to him, and if you don't, you're bad, which is what the left is arguing, and that we shouldn't take what he says seriously or literally. We have to kind of choose one, and I'm kind of happy to choose the first one.
You know, I think these kids are doing what citizens ought to do. They had a terrible experience, and they're trying to do something about it. Basically, what they're saying is the same thing that 70% of the public is out there saying, which is what we're doing with guns right now isn't working. We ought to have stricter gun laws. Now, let's have a conversation about what those gun laws should look like. I think there's a lot.
But you don't see that what the left is doing is short-circuiting honest conversations. I, for example, have tried every night since that shooting, almost every single night, to get a leader of a gun control group on. You're the only one who comes, the only one. No one else will come. I know a lot about guns. I'm interested in the topic. No one wants to have that debate. Instead, they throw David Hogg in your face and say, be quiet, and then allow David Hogg to, uninterrupted, impugn the character of anyone who disagrees with him. It's demagoguery. That's not how adults behave.
Yeah, but it's also not fair to pull one comment out of one interview out of the.
All right, I'll pull another one. Here's an idea that again, I'm being forced to take this seriously. I would be very happy to say, poor David Hogg, man, his friends got killed. I get it. He's upset. My children would be upset. I would be upset. But the left is forcing me to listen carefully to what he says because it could become the law I have to abide by. For instance, this is in the manifesto from Parkland Kids. It said there ought to be a database of which guns are sold in the United States. That ought to be paired to the status of the owner's mental health. Privacy laws should be amended. So they're saying, this march is saying, that HIPAA laws should be suspended and the U.S. government ought to keep your medical records. The public doesn't support that. Nobody supports that.
I don't know quite what that is talking about.
You want me to read it to you again? To do so, privacy laws should be amended. That a database of all guns sold in the United States ought to be paired with a database of the gun owner's mental health and physical capability.
I think what he's probably saying is that if you are actually found to be mentally unstable by a judge, that ought to be relevant to whether or not you can buy a gun.
That's already the law, as you know. That is already the law. If you're adjudicated mentally ill, it's on the form, it's in the FBI background check. I've purchased guns and filled that out, so has everyone who's done it in this country. So that already exists. I agree that there needs to be a stricter standard that keeps crazy people from getting guns. I totally agree. But to act as this march does, that if only we had the will to overcome the NRA, it's easy, we could fix it, is a lie. It's a total lie. This is complicated stuff.
Yeah, but if you take a look at, I've only taken a little bit of a look at their manifesto, but it lists like 10 or 15 different things that we ought to be doing. It's not just about one thing. And I think that's a fact. Look, there is no one legal change that's going to stop mass shootings from happening tomorrow, or that's going to stop 100 people from being killed at the barrel of a gun every day in this country. But there's a lot of things that we could be doing differently, and I think you have to concede what we're doing right now isn't working.
True, and I'm just very concerned that all this energy and the money from all these various billionaires is not making it better. It's focused instead on taking the rights away of people who didn't do anything wrong, like me, and like all of middle America, whom they hate, obviously. And there's no emphasis at all on, for example, the 4 cops with guns who stood by while 17 people were murdered. Why are they never mentioned? I'm a little confused. Talk about a failure of authorities. Where are their names here?
Look, I've heard them talked about plenty, and they all did.
Really?
Then they all did the wrong thing. Yeah, the last time I was on Fox News, we talked about that.
No, but it's a serious thing. So the NRA didn't shoot anybody. You probably don't like the NRA, but they're almost overwhelming law-abiding people. They didn't shoot a single person. These police officers, deputies, stood by and allowed this murder to take place, and yet they're getting a complete pass. Why?
Look, I don't know whether they're getting a pass or not. That's up to the people of Florida, and I hope those people aren't police deputies anymore.
No. It's up to the people running the march to set the emphasis here. Something terrible just happened. There are a lot of lessons from it, and that lesson has been buried intentionally because it doesn't entail taking away the Second Amendment rights of the innocent.
Yeah, but I think what they're saying is these mass shootings keep happening. 100 people keep getting shot every day who shouldn't be shot and have the right to, life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. What we're doing right now isn't working. Here's a list of 10 or 15 things that we are going to advocate for that we think should make a difference. There's going to be hundreds of thousands of people out there on the mall tomorrow, many of whom aren't students, who have said things you disagree with, who think that what we do isn't working. Here are the things that we should be doing.
Do we as people who seek to influence public policy have an obligation to think through what we advocate for, to learn about it,
Sure.
to consult the reams of social science that has been conducted on this subject before we advocate for something? Or is it enough to say, I feel upset, do something?
No, look, I think there is nothing unusual and a lot of things that are right about students who had a horrible experience, who believe that we should be doing things differently, coming to Washington and leading a bunch of other like-minded people, like 70% of the public.
But why doesn't someone tell this kid you're not allowed to accuse people who disagree with you of advocating for murder? That's an awful thing to say.
Well, you're saying.
But why aren't you? You're the one. I mean, he's doing a dozen interviews a day, and nobody has the courage to say, son, I'm sorry, I know you're upset, but you're not allowed to accuse people of wanting to kill children unless you can prove it.
Look, I think he was mad at the governor of his state for not doing enough. And you know what? Governor Rick Scott didn't do enough. Although I have to say, I'm kind of a fan of Rick Scott because he never met a gun or an NRA extremist he didn't like. And even he bucked the NRA because what they don't want us to do is so ridiculous.
Well, I think Rick Scott is a buffoon. That's my view. But it doesn't make me, and I do think that, but it doesn't make me any less appalled by the killing. And I hope that you and everyone else who seeks to reduce the power of the Second Amendment would at least acknowledge that I care as much about kids as anybody else does. Do you see what I'm saying?
Sure. Look, I absolutely believe that when Congress actually agrees to have a debate about this, they will go to their committees, they will go to the floor, and they will have a reasoned debate where they talk about the social science evidence about what
I hope
and
so.
what doesn't.
I hope so, and I hope it won't be dismissed as NRA lobbying, because I think these are real questions. Like, we need to reach adult conclusions.
Agreed.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're the only one who comes on. I definitely appreciate that. The media have had a lot of fun pushing unproved claims between Trump and Russia. Okay. Now, here's another angle that you may not have seen. Claims the NRA has been penetrated by the Russians somehow as well. Kim Strassel is on the Wall Street Journal editorial board, and she joins us tonight. I almost can't keep up with the various things the left doesn't like that they're claiming have been penetrated by Russia. But unpack this nutty conspiracy theory for us, if you would.
Well, what's important about this one, Tucker, is it's by the very same people, it would appear, that brought us the dossier claims as well. So you remember, the Clinton campaign hires this Fusion GPS to commission the dossier. It comes up with these fantastical dossier claims, and what's it do? It goes to the FBI in order to give them some legitimacy, even though nothing in it has been corroborated, nothing's been proved. And then once the FBI said it was doing an investigation, then everyone took it seriously. So now what we have is same people, Fusion GPS, that have been peddling to the House Intelligence Committee and others their argument, Glenn Simpson, the head of Fusion GPS, that the NRA has, quote, been infiltrated by the Russians, their top leadership, and that Russians have been filtering money through the NRA and did during 2016 to help Trump. Now, he has no evidence for this. And yet we see the media running after it and suddenly lots of stories making this claim without a shred of evidence.
Has anybody, I mean, there are some very smart people on the left and some of them who are self-aware. Has anyone said, well, maybe this is mass hysteria? If everything we don't like, every popular movement we disagree with, if our instinct is to blame unseen saboteurs from Russia, maybe we're crazy. Has anybody said that?
Nope, not that I have heard of, because as you know and I know, there is such an interest right now on Russia somehow connecting it to the Trump campaign, suggesting there are nefarious things happening around every corner. And this is just very concerning because, look, there is not one jot of evidence to this, all right? Glenn Simpson said this in testimony. He mentioned some random Russians' names. He could provide no evidence of money transfers, of any person's name in the NRA who supposedly took it. And yet you have newspaper outlets like McClatchy who continue to run newspaper articles giving credence to this. So how does the NRA, it has flatly denied it. Anyone involved with this has flatly denied it. But apparently all you have to do these days is come up with a conspiracy, have House Democrats give it credence, and then suddenly it's legitimate.
Our leaders are out of control. Emotionally, they're out of control. They're children. I'm saying it's scary, actually. It's having a big effect. Kim, thank you for explaining that to us. I appreciate your sober voice in the middle of a non-sober time. Dan Bongino is an NRA TV contributor. He's a former Secret Service agent, knows a lot about firearms, and he joins us tonight. Dan, it's good to see you. So you hesitate even to do a segment like this or a show like this because so strong is the social sanction against anybody who asks sober questions about what these kids are calling for. But is there anything, given that you have heard this march advocate for that you think sincerely would reduce school shootings or gun violence?
No, Tucker, and I'm being candid with you. I haven't. I have not heard that. I mean, I know from my experience in law enforcement that criminals don't give a rat's behind about gun laws. They just don't care. A matter of fact, gun laws are one of the few laws that put a perimeter around the fence of law-abiding people but do nothing to put a perimeter around the behavior of the non-law-abiding, the criminal, because they just don't care. They get the guns on the street. And I think we saw in Maryland recently, the only thing that's going to stop a person committed with evil in his heart to doing chaos, death, and destruction is a good guy, in fact, trained with a firearm.
I wonder, so there are going to be a lot of well-known, powerful, affluent people at tomorrow's march, morally on display like peacocks. If they really believe that guns are the problem, I wonder how many of them will bring armed bodyguards with them. And shouldn't a prerequisite of this conversation be, if you're going to advocate for gun control, you live by those standards? Why don't they, I wonder?
Because, Tucker, we're not involved in a war of facts and data and reason arguments anymore. We're involved right now, we're knee-deep in gaslighting. Gaslighting is what the media has been doing to us in conjunction with their liberal buddies and their acolytes for a long time. It's the idea that if you repeat a lie often enough, you repeat it confidently, and you isolate people from the truth, that lie will in fact become an alternate reality. We start with the Trump collusion that nobody can produce a scintilla of evidence. But, Tucker, I guarantee you, if you were to take a poll of Americans, especially liberals, probably 50% or more think it actually happened. The same thing goes for the narrative that the media wants to propagate now. The media is guns are bad, guns are the sole problem. The human being and the evil in the human heart that's existed for as long as we've been around is a non-issue. Let's not focus on that. And whatever they have to do to isolate you from the truth, simple facts like gun ownership's gone up in the United States, gun violence has gone down. That's just a simple way to do a simple correlation, and that's left out of the argument entirely because it doesn't fit the media's pre-existing worldview.
What would happen if these people, the left, right now in their current state of mind, if they took power, if they had the White House in both chambers of the Congress?
Tucker, it's pretty terrifying. I mean, I have to be candid with you. They don't really stand for anything, the left, other than the acquisition of power. I mean, they can't even stick with a coherent narrative. You know, I was chatting with someone earlier, and I said to them, you know, it's fascinating how they put so much credence into these kids marching tomorrow. And thank God they're out there doing it. Good for you. I celebrate your big R right to assemble and free speech. But the same victims of crime who are victims of terror, the angel parents who've lost kids to illegal immigrants, do you notice how the media seems to sideline their voice? They can't even stay consistent on the narrative. These people frighten me because, Tucker, they have no lodestar. And when you don't have principles guiding you and nothing's objective and everything is subjective, that gets really rough. The whole idea of the Bill of Rights was to prevent that.
So this is a question I ask myself a lot. Do you think that the rest of us make a mistake by acting as if this is a rational debate, that we can win people over and here are the facts and I've thought a lot about this and here's my position on it? Maybe we're talking to people who literally don't care what we say or what the facts are or what conclusion reason leads us to. They just want power and they're not really interested in debating. Do you ever think that?
Yeah, they're not interested in debating, Tucker. Go back and YouTube liberal comments on an issue, and they've taken opposite positions on the same issue in an effort to get votes to go away and minimize the individual and empower themselves later. Dangerous stuff.
God, I spent my whole life doing this. I hope it adds up to something. I hope that someone can be won over. It's not just
me too, brother.
Blowing in the wind. Dan, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Congress just reached a deal on the budget. The president signed it. What's it look like? What's inside those thousands of pages, and how will it affect you? We took a look. We'll tell you. Congress has passed, and the president has just signed today, a spending bill that will keep the government open and funded through next September. Trace Gallagher has been following this story from the very beginning. He's got the latest. Hey, Trace.
Hey, Tucker, the big ticket items are, one, the military. $700 billion goes for defense spending, which is $61 billion higher than last year, and the biggest defense boost in 15 years, which is why, after threatening a veto, the president ended up signing the bill. Then there's $591 billion for domestic programs, including money for road building and water projects, along with NASA, the FBI, and the IRS, and $5 billion to battle opioid abuse, up from $2 billion last year. There's also $4 million million for anti-harassment training for lawmakers and congressional aides. President Trump wanted $25 billion to build the border wall. He got $1.6 billion. There's $380 million to improve election security, and much to the dismay of conservatives, the bill also continues federal funding of Planned Parenthood. And if you missed it, GOP Senator Rand Paul was on a Twitter tear, tweeting things like the sheer size of the bill and that it funds, quote, $12 million for scholarships for Lebanon, $20 million for Middle East Partnership Initiative scholarship programs, $12 million in military funding for Vietnam, $3.5 million for nutrition assistance to Laos, $15 million in developmental assistance to China, and $10 million for women law enforcement officers in Afghanistan. And that, Tucker, is your budget roundup for this Friday. Tucker.
Thanks, Trace. President Trump criticized today's budget bill even as he signed it. The deal is suboptimal, he suggested. It's certainly expensive. The legislation will trigger a $1 trillion deficit or come very close to that. That's great news here in D.C., by the way. The Range Rover dealership outside Washington is probably packed even now at this hour as lobbyists and contractors reward themselves for a job well done. They just got a massive raise. It's party time in D.C. There's an awful lot of pork in this thing. Given the cost, you'd think at the very least the bill would fund the critical needs of our country. Does it do that? Not even close. The legislation signed today is pretty much the opposite of what America voted for in 2016. The bill actively restricts the hiring of additional ICE agents for immigration enforcement. It caps the number of illegals ICE can detain at any one time. Ostensibly, it allocates $1.6 billion for border security. You may have heard that. What you may not know is that that money is explicitly prohibited from being spent on any kind of border wall, the wall that voters asked for in the last election. Now, Republicans may have found extra wall money by, I don't know, cutting funds to those sanctuary cities that are actively undermining federal law. But they didn't do that. Sanctuary cities will continue to be subsidized just as they always have been. And so, by the way, will the abortion enthusiasts at Planned Parenthood. Republicans repeatedly promised to defund Planned Parenthood, remember? But they're not. They're awarding Planned Parenthood another $500 million in tax dollars. In other words, nothing's changed. It's just gotten a lot worse. The message to the rest of us could not be clearer. Congress does not care about the territorial integrity of the country it runs. The people in charge of both major parties are committed to making sure that we never have meaningful borders of any kind. Anyone who manages to get here will get a job, welfare, health care, education, forever. Meanwhile, middle America continues to die. Those are Congress's priorities. Though in fairness, the bill actually does pay for border security, just not here in America. Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Tunisia, they all get American tax dollars to deal with their immigration problems. And congratulations. Also included in the bill is a $10 million chunk to hire female law enforcement in Afghanistan. $10 million for disadvantaged students in Egypt, not Egypt, Maine, Egypt, the country. $12 million to boost the military capacity of Vietnam. And how about China? Our greatest geopolitical and economic rival. Well, the bill gives the Chinese $15 million in development aid, some of which go to promoting yak herding in Tibet. And on top of all of that, Congress gave itself a pay raise, needless to say. We'd love to have a Republican member of Congress on to explain why exactly we're sending money to China, which is rapidly overtaking us economically. But somehow we can't find any money to secure American borders. And we asked more than a dozen members of Congress to come on the show tonight. They all refused. And of course, you can see why. But here's an idea. Any member of Congress who supports sending tax dollars to China ought to resign from Congress tonight and give up his pension. That's a betrayal of our country. If only we knew who put that in the bill. It's a secret, of course. Members of Congress may not protect you, but they definitely protect each other. We do know that Paul Ryan signed off on that. Of course he did. Well, we're told we need this bill because of national security. But how secure is a nation that has no borders? Well, about as secure as a political party that has no rationale for existing, that treats its own voters like dupes and fools, that ignores election results like they didn't happen. Parties like that don't last long, and they shouldn't. Well, there is mass panic in Washington about the power of tech companies to sway elections. But it's not Cambridge Analytica in 2016 we ought to be worried about. It's Google and Facebook in the next election. They could make all the difference. We'll tell you how. Stay tuned. Cambridge Analytica has been in the news for the first time ever. Of course, it's a British research firm, and it's now being accorded the technical prowess of a Bond villain, according to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and all the other hyenas. Cambridge Analytica apparently is able to swing an election with some Facebook data and a few million bucks. Did that happen? No, it didn't. But even if it's absurd to think a small data company could have changed the 2016 presidential election, it doesn't mean that bigger tech companies couldn't do that in the future. Dr. Robert Epstein is a senior research psychologist for the American Institute for Behavioral Research and Technology. He's looked into this carefully and has found some interesting potential facts about it. Dr. Epstein joins us tonight. Doctor, I don't want to make anybody, any of our viewers paranoid, but we talk a lot about the potential effect of big tech on how we live and on our democracy. You've looked into what Google and Facebook could do in an election. Tell us what you found.
Well, Tucker, I've been studying this very carefully now for more than 5 years with multiple randomized controlled experiments around the world for national elections. And I can tell you that we should be paranoid, because what Google and Facebook can do is really mind-boggling. If, for example, if Mark Zuckerberg on Election Day last year, if he had chosen to press the enter key early morning and just sent out a message to Hillary Clinton supporters only saying, go out and vote, a go out and vote reminder, that would have sent her an additional 450,000 voters that day, with no one knowing that this had occurred. And that's just Facebook. What Google can do is really off the scale. Our experiments show that Google can take a 50-50 split among undecided voters and change it into a 90-10 split with no one knowing that they have been manipulated and without leaving a paper trail for authorities to follow.
How? How could Google do that?
Well, this is work that we're about to break. This is news that's about to break about our newest research, so I can't really go into detail. But it has to do with those search suggestions. Literally, from the very first character that you type into the search bar, you are being manipulated. And we've done 16 months of experiments. We have all the details now. We know exactly how this works. So they've got the search suggestions, which people are just oblivious to. And then, of course, the search results down below. We know from our 5 years of work on search results that just by putting those in a certain order, which people really can't see, just by favoring one candidate over another in search results, that can easily produce shifts among undecided voters of 20% or more, up to 80% in some demographic groups, again, with no one aware that this is occurring.
I mean, my jaw's open. I mean, I've thought about this stuff a lot, and even I am shocked by this. By the way, our Congress is spending its time funding yak herding in Tibet. I mean, in 10 seconds, do you think that the threat is profound enough to warrant intervention by lawmakers?
The threat is absolutely, positively profound. If you could look at the numbers that I look at now every day, if any of our Congress people could look at these numbers, they would be stunned, and they would take action, I guarantee it.
Boy, I hope that video of this conversation goes everywhere on Facebook and Google. I guess, Dr. Epstein, thank you. That was amazing. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tucker.
Well, speaking of big tech, the Southern Poverty Law Center, believe it or not, is being used as a fact checker by Google and Snopes and others. Are they objective enough to determine what news you're allowed to see? That's a rhetorical question. We've got details ahead.
At Joe.com.
The Southern Poverty Law Center has, ironically, no expertise on the South or poverty or the law. It pretends to be an expert on hate groups, but of course the irony is it is one. Trey Radel is a former congressman from the state of Florida. He just wrote an expose on how the Southern Poverty Law Center attacks, harasses, terrorizes people it doesn't agree with across the country, and everyone's afraid to say so except him, which is why he joins us tonight. Congressman, thanks for coming on. What happened? Tell us your experience with the SPLC.
Sure. So Southern Poverty Law Center is now one of these trusted partnerships with Google and YouTube, flagging videos that are of hate speech. Look, in 2013, when I was in Congress, I did an interview with a blogger who interpreted my interview saying that we need checks and balances on the executive branch as that I wanted to suddenly impeach President Obama. Well, sure enough, with the way that viral news travels, no journalist from even credible news organizations called me. They circulated this story that I wanted to impeach President Obama, which I never, ever said. Sure enough, I never received a call from the Southern Poverty Law Center a few months later who put me on their list of haters and extremists. Now, look, what I'm about to say, I don't say to toot my own horn, but I'm trilingual. I have lived in or backpacked around the world, living off like $10 a day because I love culture, I love people, and I love to learn. I've always done everything I can to inject myself into foreign cultures to absorb as much as I can. And of course, I've always loved politics and foreign policy. They put me on a list, man, with a guy who went into a Sikh temple in Wisconsin, shot it up and killed 6 people, and a whole litany list of neo-Nazis.
And this was, I mean, not that I doubted, but I just want to make sure I have this precisely, simply because they believed you called for Obama's impeachment, which, by the way, is a constitutional mechanism. I mean, you know, people can agree or disagree, but that's not the same as hate speech. I mean, people call for impeachment all the time. Right.
At all. And yet you're exactly right. It's a process, right? And if we remove our emotion from it, it is what it is, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. Right. Again, I never even called for his impeachment, but I was placed on that list, and they tried to essentially discredit and destroy me. The other person on that list, by the way, was Senator Rand Paul. Senator Rand Paul, too, who has been a vocal opponent of things like the war on drugs, saying how hurtful it is to our minority communities around the United States. But because we have an R by our names, we have been discredited and called haters. Look, Tucker, I would even go to President Donald Trump. Before President Donald Trump was president, you had this whole narrative has changed on him. He at one time was beloved by hip-hop stars who wanted their picture with him and sang about him. Democrats gladly took his money from him. As soon as he becomes a Republican candidate for president of the United States, suddenly he's a misogynist, bigoted hater. I swear to God, if Republicans had a lesbian, gay, transgender, or gender-fluid, multiracial candidate that was attempting to get into the White House today, that person, too, would be called bigoted, misogynistic, and hateful.
Yeah, I think we're too literal. It's not about any of that. It's about power, and anything that gets in the way of their acquiring and wielding power must be destroyed. Thank you for reminding us of that, Congressman. Trey Riddle joining us.
Good to be with you, Tucker.
Military pilots keep encountering aircraft that do things they can't explain, that seem to defy the basic laws of physics. This is happening a lot. It's happened for many years. The Pentagon knows, but they're not interested in investigating it. Why is that? We're going to talk to someone who was at the center of this story at the Pentagon next.
Say I do to a smile you'll love at SmileDirectClub.com.
Over and over and over again, U.S. military pilots have cited, sometimes at very close range, aircraft whose appearance and behavior they cannot explain, that science itself, the laws of physics, cannot explain. Now, it almost doesn't matter what this is. It doesn't have to be extraterrestrial to be a real concern to U.S. national security. And some are concerned. But as an organization, the Pentagon doesn't seem to be, and doesn't seem to be interested in investigating. Why not, is the question. Christopher Mellon is a National Security Affairs Advisor for the To the Stars Academy of Arts and Science. He's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, and he joins us tonight. Mr. Mellon, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure, Tucker. Thank you.
So I want to make sure I'm not overstating that. Military pilots have seen at relatively close range objects, aircraft apparently doing things that aircraft we didn't think were able to do, and they've taken video of that. Is that true?
That's true, although that's only part of the evidence. What's so compelling about the evidence is we have our finest military personnel and our most sophisticated sensors all corroborating the information independently on multiple platforms. So some of these platforms are the same platforms we would use to defend the United States from a ballistic missile attack from, say, North Korea. If those systems are malfunctioning in some way, finding that out alone would be a huge benefit. I don't think that's the case. There's no evidence of that. Let me tell you a brief story that may add some color and make this a little bit more palpable. After my op-ed appeared with the video, I got a call from an individual retired from the Defense Department and who had worked on these issues, and I asked him, I said, do you have any context for that video? Do you have any details? He told me that was one of 2 videos that came into the Pentagon from the commander of a carrier battle group. And these are his words. He described it as a plea for help, end quote.
That's terrifying. So, I mean, these are aircraft unidentified that are operating in very close proximity to the U.S. military, to ships and planes. We can assume it's not American, or they wouldn't be that close. Can we assume that it's aircraft from a foreign country? I mean, do we have a working theory on this? What does the Pentagon think about this?
We don't have a working theory, and the most fundamental problem, and it's a self-inflicted problem, and frankly a fairly easy problem to correct, and one of the reasons I wanted to write the article is because we have on the one hand something of immense, almost incalculable strategic importance, something that raises fundamental questions about the viability of our air defenses, about our aircraft. Many of these incidents have occurred in recent years within minutes of flying distance of the National Capital Region. So we have a very real and compelling body of evidence. On the other hand, we know that many of the problems can be easily solved if someone would just step forward. So what I'm talking about here is to provide an analogy that people may be able to relate to more readily than the complex DoD bureaucracy. The bombings recently in Austin, Texas, imagine if every time one of these bombs went off, you had a different police department responding, and none of these people were talking to each other, and nobody was in charge, right? Those bombings would probably still be going on. That's what's happening today. The different services, departments, agencies, the FBI,
of course,
people are gaining information, they're not sharing it, which is very reminiscent, unfortunately, of what happened before 9/11.
So give us, in the 50 seconds we have left, give us a sense of the scale here. You say these things are happening over the past 20 years. How many, roughly, would you say, credible sightings there have been by the U.S. military?
Yeah, it's hard to say over the last 20 years, and there's a difference. And one of the differences is that we're deploying much more capable sensors that provide a higher degree of fidelity. So whereas 15 years ago, we might get pilot reports saying, I saw a bright light out there. Now we're getting reports from an Aegis-class cruiser that says this thing came down from 80,000 feet, descended to 20,000 feet, dropped to 50 feet and hovered, then maneuvered towards the carrier, and then pilots are independently seeing it and confirming it and filming it. So it's a very different...
We're out of time. I hope this tape goes everywhere. Thank you for your bravery. Good to see you. We'll be right back.
What are you running from?